In the courtroom of the small town of Vale, the oak benches gleamed with a cold, hard light. Eloan pressed her fingertips against her knees, her nails nearly digging into the palms of her hands. She didn't dare take a deep breath, afraid that the wildly pounding heart in her chest might burst right through her throat. The sound was so loud she began to wonder if even the national emblem hanging on the wall could hear it. Across the table, Thorne sat with his back perfectly straight, his custom-tailored suit outlined an air of arrogant composure, as if this trial, this very hearing that would decide their fates, were already firmly in his grasp. His thin lips parted slightly, and his words, sharp as shards of ice-hardened glass, pierced her eardrums with agonizing precision. From today onward, don't you dare take another single penny from my account. Beside him, Sorrel tilted her head ever so slightly. Her chestnut curls hung loose over her shoulders, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile curled up at the corners of her mouth. That smile carried a smugness so subtle, yet so insidious, like fine needles silently pricking her skin. She replied in a barely audible whisper, her voice tinged with bitterness. Honey, she never deserved it anyway. What choked Eloan the most was Thorne's mother, Morgaine, the elderly woman who always wore a pearl necklace. At this moment, with lips painted in a bean-paste pink, she declared, word by word, "She doesn't even qualify to own a single item from our family." Each sentence felt like a heavy hammer striking Eloan's already shattered heart. But just then, Judge Kyle picked up the thick envelope she had handed over, his fingertips tracing the seal's wax impression before slowly opening it. He glanced at only 2 pages, yet his usually calm gaze suddenly narrowed sharply. Then, a short, sharp laugh burst forth, shattering the courtroom's eerie silence. The laughter echoed through the empty room, instantly freezing the triumphant expressions on Thorne and his brother's faces. Kyle set down the envelope, his eyes locking onto them like those of a hawk, his voice low but carrying the weight of 1,000 tons. "You thought you'd hidden it well?" In that instant, Eloan clearly saw Thorne's Adam's apple bob violently, Sorrel's smile frozen into a mask, and Morgaine's pearl necklace swaying slightly along with her trembling shoulders. Eloan, once a canary trapped in a golden cage by them, today is the one who opens the cage door herself, sending those abusers plummeting into the abyss they've dug for themselves. Before I share this thorny journey of retaliation, I'd like to know, are you, right there on the screen, willing to walk alongside me? Please leave a "I'm here" in the comments, or let me know which city you're in. I'm always curious about just how far this courage, hidden away in the dead of night, can reach. Sometimes, a simple reply can warm a heart that's been bearing its burden all alone. Thank you so much. Now the story officially begins. If you believe this tale of rising from the depths deserves to be seen by more people, I sincerely ask that you subscribe to this channel. For many, the first step toward rebirth isn't about defeating others. It's about being heard. And every bit of your support can help voices like mine, once silenced, find their rightful place in this world. As I slowly sat down, the wooden chair sent a strangely untimely chill through me. The hard edges dug into my spine, as if constantly reminding me of just how precarious my position was in this battlefield disguised as a courtroom. The air conditioner in the small town of Well hummed softly, its icy breeze sweeping across the polished floor. For a fleeting moment, I wondered whether anyone else could feel this coldness too. Perhaps not. Maybe it had singled me out, for as soon as I sat down, I distinctly sensed waves of disdain emanating from the other end of the room. Sorrel's clenched jaw, the carefully forced smile he'd meticulously crafted, and Morgan's smug expression with his lips tightly pressed together. They all seemed to have been waiting for this very day, rehearsing endlessly my downfall until it had become a family heirloom they could finally take pride in. The courtroom's very atmosphere made everything feel strikingly sharp. The dark wood walls reflected the blurred shadows of people shifting restlessly in their seats, like echoes of the trial itself. I caught a glimpse of Judge Kyle adjusting his glasses, the sharpness in his eyes pierced through the chaos swirling in my mind. His very presence somehow gave me a strange sense of reassurance. He looked like someone who'd seen it all, the myriad human deceptions, and could instantly tell at a glance who was lying, who was putting on an act, and who was merely struggling to survive. I clung tightly to this glimmer of hope, even as I watched Thorne sit confidently behind his legal team, three men dressed in custom-tailored suits whose very posture seemed to have breathing counted as part of their billable hours. Meanwhile, Mr. Peregrine, seated beside me, shifted restlessly back and forth. A lawyer from the Public Interest Law Aid Center, he made every effort to avoid prolonged eye contact, but beneath his hesitation lay a quiet composure, a calmness that I knew I could rely on today. Then, finally, Thorne's long-anticipated knockout blow came. He leaned slightly forward, making sure his words reached my ears, his voice low yet sharp as a blade. From today on, don't even think about taking another penny from my account. Before I could steady myself, Sorrel snuggled up beside him. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a costly fragrance, yet laced with a poisonous undertone. Honey, she never deserved any of this to begin with, she purred, her voice as languid as a cat's meow, cruel yet tinged with an air of careless indifference. Meanwhile, Morgan, ever eager to gloat over others' misfortunes, didn't even bother to lower his voice. Instead, he blurted out without hesitation, "She doesn't even qualify to own a single thing in our house." If words could leave scars, I'd already be covered in wounds. Yet beneath this stinging pain, something deeper was stirring, a spark of defiance I'd been carefully nurturing for months. I let each insult wash over me, not because I was powerless to fight back, but because striking too soon would ruin everything I'd painstakingly built up for this very moment. They think I've lost everything, no power, no leverage, no voice. But they still don't know the truth, at least not yet. My gaze shifted to Mr. Peregrine, and I saw his hand tremble slightly as he reached for that worn leather briefcase. He pulled out the white envelope, the very envelope I'd prepared with every ounce of fear, every calculated move, and every scrap of truth I'd managed to gather. His fingers were shaking, but not because he doubted me. Rather, it was because he knew exactly how heavy what lay inside was. As he gently set the envelope down on the table, a dark yet resolute emotion welled up within me. They have absolutely no idea what's about to come. Not one of them. Today isn't the day I've lost everything. It's the day the truth finally sees the light of day. The truths they've buried, manipulated, and mocked. The truths they never once imagined I'd have the courage to collect. I straightened my spine, my heart filled with but one thought. This wasn't the ending they'd planned. It was only the beginning of the ending they truly deserved. Looking back on that day from 7 years ago now feels both unbelievably distant and agonizingly vivid. Whenever I allow myself to recall that day, the day I first met Thorne Gray at an antique book fair in downtown Bozeman, my memory becomes startlingly clear. At the time, I was a book restorer, my fingertips still carrying the faint scent of paste used to mend paper pages. Thorne, meanwhile, was a relatively well-known art dealer, standing quietly by a medieval manuscript, engaged in a hushed conversation with the vendor. I can still picture the warm glow of the hall's lights reflecting off the glass display cases and the polished marble floors, and I remember how effortlessly he seemed to blend into that world brimming with antiques and works of art. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit that seemed tailored precisely to his ambitions, and on his face hung a charming smile, one that could make people pause mid-conversation. At the time, I was still young and yearned for stability. Coming from an ordinary background, I'd never before set foot in a world like the one he inhabited. So when he looked at me with those eyes that made me feel utterly important, I found myself completely entranced by this illusion. He moved with remarkable speed, pulling me effortlessly into his world, a world brimming with promises and grand plans. For the first time, I thought I'd finally stepped into a life that was stable, predictable, and perhaps even beautiful. And so, when he proposed to me at sunset atop Bridger Peak, with the sky ablaze in fiery orange hues behind him, I said yes, without a second thought. But little did I know then that, hidden behind him, another pair of eyes was watching me, Morgan Gray, a retired art appraiser who regarded me as if I were some unrequested commodity, an unpredictable variable she simply couldn't trust. That day, her smile held not a trace of warmth, only calculation. Even so, I still married him, and for a fleeting moment, I truly believed I'd made the right decision. It wasn't until I first stepped onto Grey Manor that my conviction began to crumble. The mansion was indeed breathtaking. The white stone walls, the soaring ceilings, the stunning views overlooking Montana's prairies. But this beauty was cold and lifeless. More than a home, it felt like a stage, and I'd been chosen to play the role of the obedient wife, expected to perform my part with precision, delivering my lines exactly as scripted. The constraints began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Thorne suggested I quit my job restoring ancient books, saying he could handle everything himself and urging me to focus entirely on building our future. Then came the restrictions on spending, asking me incessantly where I'd been, who I'd met, and why I needed anything beyond the family card he controlled. Bold my friends gradually faded from my life, and my world slowly shrank to the confines of the estate and to his expectations. At first, I told myself that this was just another way of showing love, care, protection. But then I uncovered some of Morgan's secrets, whispers among relatives that I'd overheard by chance at a dinner party. Years ago, taking advantage of her position as an art appraiser, she'd manipulated the valuation of Thorne's father's collection, leaving behind a string of broken partnerships and shattered trust. Suddenly, all the coldness, the rigid rules, the insatiable desire to control everything, all of it made perfect sense. This family didn't know how to love. They only knew how to dominate, mold, and suffocate. Countless nights, lying awake in that oversized bed, I finally confronted a question I'd been avoiding. Did Thorne ever really love me? Bold. Or was it simply that I happened to fill a role someone else needed, a role he could shape, control, and ultimately discard? That was the first time I realized that the dreamland I'd thought I'd stepped into might, from the very beginning, have been nothing more than a prison disguised as the future. Even so, at the time, I never imagined the truth would be far darker still. Looking back now, I see that the whole thing didn't collapse overnight. Rather, it began quietly, almost subtly, almost with a touch of courtesy, slipping unnoticed into the cracks between Thorne's words and the silences he left behind. He started coming home later and later. At first, the changes were barely perceptible. He claimed it was due to art acquisitions, late-night appraisals, or last-minute business deals. But it wasn't the times themselves that gave him away. It was the way he'd changed during those hours. His once routine appetite had suddenly shifted. He'd begun craving foods he'd previously insisted were far too greasy. He started spraying a new perfume I'd never smelled before, a scent sharp and intense. When he tossed his shirt into the laundry basket, the fragrance lingered on it, as if he were discarding some kind of evidence. When I told him I was considering returning to the field of ancient book restoration, hoping to have something truly my own, he dismissed the idea with an overreactive, fiery intensity. He said it would disrupt our family's rhythm and that now wasn't the right time. Yet the look in his eyes revealed what he hadn't said aloud. He didn't want me to become independent. He wanted me to remain quietly obedient forever. Then came the first clear signal. While helping Thorne wash clothes, a receipt slipped out of his pocket, a tiny white slip from an upscale French restaurant in the historic district of Vale, its price far exceeding anything we'd ever eaten together over the years. I stared closely at the details on the bill, and a knot formed in my stomach. 2 main courses, a bottle of burgundy red wine he'd once mocked as being overpriced, and a dessert for 2. The table number was printed clearly, but what unsettled me most was the reservation note. It wasn't made under his name. It simply said, Gray's Party. The detail was subtle enough to slip past most people's notice, but not mine. A few days later, I found another clue on his phone. A calendar reminder he'd forgotten to delete, a faint afterimage, just a fleeting pop-up from the reservation app that had since vanished. Yet that single clue was enough to confirm the growing suspicion deepening in my heart. The ground beneath my feet was quietly crumbling away. One evening, when Thorne stepped out dressed far too formally, wearing a tie he hadn't touched in months, I made a decision without hesitation. I was going to follow him. I drove behind him at a distance of several cars, my palms gripping the steering wheel so tightly that I struggled not to imagine every possible scenario that could go wrong. He drove straight into the historic district of Whitehorse and parked near the very same restaurant mentioned on that receipt. From across the street, I watched as his heart rate seemed to echo in my ears. I saw him get out of the car, adjust his coat, and look around with an air of anticipation, a kind of expectation he'd long since stopped showing toward me. Then, she stepped toward him, Sorrel Bates. I recognized her at a glance. She was the renowned owner of an independent art gallery in Bozeman, a figure who often graced the art magazines Morgans had collected. Tall and elegant, dressed as if she'd been born to live forever in the soft glow of a photo studio, she took Thorne's hand with natural grace and confidence, as if that hand had always belonged to her. Together, they walked into the restaurant, heading toward the corner table where Thorne and I had once celebrated our wedding anniversary. Something inside me shattered quietly, cleanly, and decisively. Yet I still raised my phone and snapped a photo of them because at that moment, evidence mattered more than emotion. I stayed in the car, watching them laugh and chat effortlessly. Her hand gently brushed against his arm, and his gaze was unbearably tender, such a look I hadn't seen in ages. By the time I got home, the prairie sky had already turned pitch black. As I stepped into the entryway, I found Morgan waiting for me, her arms crossed tightly, her expression one of disdain, a sneer she'd clearly rehearsed countless times before. She glanced briefly at my outfit, then snorted derisively. "Elowen," she said, "you really should know better than to go out looking like this. It's a disgrace to our family." Her voice dripped with feigned indignation, but beneath it all, I sensed something far sharper. She knew. She knew I hadn't been home. She knew exactly where I'd been. Standing in this empty manor, surrounded by marble and carefully selected works of art, I suddenly realized that those three, Thorne, Sorrel, and Morrigan, had long since formed an alliance. They wanted to push me out of their circle, quietly, efficiently, and ideally in a way that would leave me utterly humiliated. Yet there was one thing that just didn't add up. Thorne had always been incredibly tight-fisted when it came to money, shrewd, calculating, even scrutinizing supermarket receipts as if they were art appraisal reports. But lately, he'd been spending lavishly. On restaurants, on gifts, and on those prolonged absences that required him to concoct elaborate excuses. Something was definitely off here. Beneath this blatant betrayal, there had to be an even deeper secret lurking. I knew that before they used these secrets to crush me completely, I had to uncover the truth. And the truth revealed itself on an otherwise unremarkable, quiet afternoon. After receiving a call that left the atmosphere tense, Thorne hurriedly dashed out of the house, forgetting to lock the office door. Ever since he'd moved into Gray Manor, that door had always served as a boundary, a place he guarded fiercely, a room he'd never let me clean. Seeing the door unlocked sent a complex mix of emotions surging through me, half fear, half opportunity. I should have turned around and walked away, but some deeper force seemed to be pulling me forward. My hands trembled slightly as I pushed open the door and stepped into the space that concealed a side of Thorne no one else ever knew about. The room was filled with the scent of expensive leather and old paper. His desk was impeccably organized, yet beneath that neat exterior lay a chaos disguised as an art dealing operation. I opened the first drawer and found several bank statements, 3 accounts I'd never seen before, each registered under slight variations of his name, none of them connected to our joint assets. The account balance was enormous and unusually volatile, with fluctuations that simply didn't conform to the patterns typical of legitimate art transactions. On the shelf above the desk sat a stack of folders, each labeled with seemingly neutral descriptions, but one in particular caught my attention. Gray Art Circulation Company, Limited. I'd never heard of this company before. Driven by curiosity, I opened the folder, only to find a series of art transaction records. The frequency of buying and selling was absurdly high, and the prices were suspiciously inflated. Clearly, these documents had been meticulously forged. Everything seemed utterly seamless, as if someone had gone to great lengths to ensure these papers wouldn't attract any suspicion. Then I came across some invoices, bills from jewelry designers, gift receipts, and even a reservation record for a luxurious stay at the Breege Landscape Inn. Each receipt bore Thorne's signature, yet the payment accounts had nothing to do with our family's bank accounts. The reservation information for the hotel listed Sorrel's name. My throat tightened suddenly, yet I forced myself to keep reading. At the very bottom of the drawer, hidden beneath a pile of old art appraisal reports, I found a leather-bound notebook. The pages were covered with rows of handwritten numbers, encrypted initials, and cash records, amounts so staggering they made my stomach churn. Hundreds of thousands of dollars flowed in and out in cash, meticulously documented to an almost obsessive degree. Some pages even featured symbols I didn't recognize, mysterious markings that clearly indicated transactions that were anything but legal. As I turned to the end of the notebook, a loose sheet of paper slipped out and floated down onto the floor. I picked it up, expecting yet another pile of meaningless numbers, but instead, I found what seemed to be a ledger from an entirely different world. Transfer records tracing back to a name I'd never heard before, the Scarlet Serpent, a drug trafficking syndicate operating along the Montana-Canada border. I stared at the piece of paper, my breathing rapid and uneven. This wasn't just about infidelity, wasn't just about lies. Thorne had gotten himself involved in something dangerous, something illegal. The lavish lifestyle we'd once cherished now felt utterly tainted and filthy. Carefully and methodically, I put everything back exactly where it belonged, then slipped out of the office, closing the door softly behind me. The lock clicked shut, a sound that seared itself into my very bones. For years, I'd lived in the shadow of this family, bending to their demands, stifling my own instincts, gradually surrendering my independence bit by bit. But standing there in that hallway, clutching the scorching truth in my hand, a whole new realization began to crystallize. I'd had enough of living in their darkness. It was time to bring the light into the picture. After discovering the ledger linked to the Crimson Serpent, I spent the entire night wide awake. Fear surged through me like a cold current, but even more powerful was an unprecedented clarity, the realization that Thorne's control over money, his hidden secrets, his reckless spending, all finally made sense. And that knowledge pierced my heart like a blade. The next day, I immediately reached out to my former colleague, Bryce Reed, who had switched careers to become a forensic accountant, a rare person who'd ever made me feel truly understood. We met at a cafe in Bozeman, and as soon as she glanced at the ledger entries, she recognized them as fitting the pattern of money laundering through art. She warned me not to act rashly, without legal protection. Her words jolted me awake and only strengthened my resolve. I dialed the FBI's Bozeman office, ending my anonymity and fully disclosing my relationship with Thorne as well as everything I'd uncovered. That very afternoon, Agent Jasper Cole met with me. He informed me that the Scarlet Serpent was a long-term surveillance target, and until now, there'd been no solid evidence linking Thorne directly to criminal activity. He solemnly cautioned me that people like Thorne were deeply entangled with drug cartels, and if they realized I'd learned the truth, I'd find myself in grave danger. Despite the deep fear gripping me, I agreed without hesitation to cooperate fully with the investigation. I'd come to realize that this was no longer just a simple marital betrayal. It was a major crime involving transnational drug trafficking and money laundering. Stepping out of the FBI building into Montana's scorching sun, I was left with only one thought. Once I'd embarked on this path, there'd be no turning back. Though this struggle far exceeded the bounds of marriage, I would never back down. After reconnecting with the FBI and returning to Gray Manor, I was no longer the submissive wife I once was. Instead, I had to transform myself into a shadow, silently observing Thorne's odd behavior, his frantic checks of unknown calls, his late-night retreats to the courtyard to answer the phone, and the lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume on his clothes. Following Agent Jasper's instructions, I began gathering evidence. One evening, when Thorne lied about attending an art appraisal and stepped out, I slipped into the garage and installed a recording device in his car. Just as I finished, he suddenly turned around to retrieve the appraisal report. In a moment of sheer ingenuity, I pretended to tidy up the storage area and managed to slip away unnoticed. Later recordings revealed that Thorne wasn't just laundering money. He'd become deeply entangled in a drug trafficking ring, frequently receiving threats related to fund transfers and cargo deliveries. At the same time, Morgan has stepped up her persecution tactics, pressuring me to sign a waiver relinquishing my property rights under the pretext of protecting the family's assets. Thorne and Sorrel's relationship has become increasingly open, and I even came across their reservation records for the Bridger View Inn. One late night, I recorded outside Thorne's office an urgent conversation he was having with someone about cargo and drug cartels, then immediately sent it to Agent Jasper. His only reply was, "We're getting closer, stay sharp." I know full well that Thorne's downfall is imminent, yet I too am standing on the brink of a dangerous precipice. Since the Las Vegas incident, the atmosphere at the estate has grown heavier and heavier, with an eerie silence concealing deadly threats. Thorne's suspicion toward me has skyrocketed. His gaze has become piercingly sharp and lingers unnervingly long, and his questioning has become ever more meticulous, constantly probing into my whereabouts and the people I've been in contact with. I force myself to remain calm, weaving excuses in a gentle tone, using this facade as my sole shield of self-preservation, even though inside, my heart is already churning with turmoil. One afternoon, Sorrel Bates brazenly burst into the manor as if she were the rightful owner, claiming she'd come to finalize the art display plan for the new study, a blatant act of defiance. She placed a sample board on the table, her gaze fixed firmly on me, and declared with smug satisfaction, "Thorne has already set the stage for his new life." That self-assured cruelty made it instantly clear. This marriage had long since ceased to be merely an act of betrayal. It was, in fact, a carefully orchestrated conspiracy hatched by both of them to eliminate me once and for all. That very night, I noticed Thorne frequently slipping into his office. Taking advantage of his deep sleep, I sneaked in and discovered he'd locked a silver USB drive into a hidden safe behind the bookshelf. Braving the risk, I copied the contents, and what I found there left me utterly horrified. The drive contained records of 12 suspicious fund transfers, and even more terrifyingly, my name had been inserted into one of those transactions. He was planning to make me the scapegoat, framing me as the money launderer for a drug-dealing operation. To my surprise, I also uncovered a surveillance camera hidden in the office. Without delay, I disabled the Wi-Fi and unplugged all the cables, determined to keep my whereabouts from being exposed. Misfortunes never come singly. That evening, Thorne took my phone under the pretext of checking a delivery, and just then, Bryce's message popped up on the screen. He demanded an explanation in a harsh tone. In my panic, I quickly came up with a lie. I claimed we were catching up and discussing potential collaboration on ancient book restoration. Only then did I barely manage to talk my way out of it. At that moment, though I hadn't yet realized he'd already installed a tracker on my phone, I could clearly sense his paranoia and the danger lurking within him. As I looked at him sleeping peacefully beside me, I suddenly became utterly sober. This man wasn't just unfaithful and cruel. He was determined to ruin my life. This divorce had long since become a battle for survival between him and me. Before the prairie had even begun to dawn, Thorne announced that he was heading to Jackson Hole for an art fair. His tone was brusque, his movements tense. In an instant, I knew this trip was anything but a routine business excursion. The timing was far too suspicious, and the atmosphere around us was unnaturally heavy. Combined with clues from the audio recordings, I'd already figured out that he was actually meeting with an intermediary from a drug trafficking syndicate. This trip was all about money and loyalty, a high-stakes gamble he simply couldn't afford to lose. I proposed that we work together to save our marriage, but he flatly rejected my suggestion. Behind his unusual resistance lay a fear that couldn't be hidden, and that only made me more certain that Jackson Hole harbored a deadly danger. As soon as he drove away, I immediately put on the transmitter provided by the FBI and set off on the long journey to Wyoming. Upon arrival, I rented a room across from the hotel where he was staying. Using signal tracking equipment, I locked onto his phone and finally followed the red on the screen, sneaking into the hotel's underground parking garage. Hiding behind a concrete pillar, I witnessed Thorn handing over heavy suitcases to two towering men who were speaking urgently in Spanish. Fighting back the tremor in my hands, I managed to snap a photo of this crucial evidence with my phone. Unexpectedly, one of the men suddenly turned his head, scanning the shadows. I froze instantly, frantically dashed back to my room, bolted the door, and immediately called Agent Jasper. His voice was grave as he informed me that the drug cartel had lost trust in Thorn, and if my presence were ever exposed, everyone involved would be in grave danger. As soon as he finished speaking, Thorn's phone rang. His voice was frantic, no longer the confident tone I'd grown accustomed to. Instead, he begged me not to go near Jackson Hole, bluntly telling me that the situation had spiraled completely out of control. It was the first time I'd ever seen him so utterly terrified, and I realized then that he'd already sunk deep into a quagmire from which there was no escape. After hanging up, I sent the video evidence to the FBI and didn't drive back to the small town of Vale until well past midnight. Back at Gray Manor, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror. Though the long journey had left me looking haggard, my eyes were filled with unwavering determination. Staring at my reflection, I whispered softly to myself, "I'll never let Thorn, Morrigan, or those criminals destroy me." After everything I'd been through, I was no longer afraid, not of their threats or their lies. What scared me more than anything else was returning to those old days of silent submission and self-restraint. That cowardly version of myself was gone forever. Even though the road ahead remained uncertain, this was my path to rebirth, and I was fully prepared for the final showdown in court. That night, as I drove across the grassland under an endless expanse of starry sky, I took a deep, genuine breath for the first time in years. The vast emptiness of those long highways, the honesty hidden within the darkness, brought me an inexplicable sense of comfort. I thought about how easily we can lose ourselves in other people's stories, a process that unfolds so quietly that before we even realize it, we've already become deeply entangled, no longer speaking with our own voice. I couldn't help but wonder, right at this moment, are there others, perhaps feeling lonely, perhaps gripped by fear, perhaps trapped in their own personal prisons, waging a battle that no one else knows about? Now I've come to understand a simple truth. Sometimes survival means making tiny, quiet decisions in the darkness. Sometimes it simply means choosing to keep breathing even when we're terrified. And sometimes it means summoning the courage to stand up, even if our legs are trembling. Sometimes it means choosing to speak the truth, even if your voice is trembling. Other times, it means gathering all your experiences and firmly saying, enough. If you're listening to this story right now, if you followed along all the way here, I want you to know I'm truly grateful. Sharing all of this hasn't been easy. It's not just a recounting of events, it's also a part of my life that I've fought so hard to reclaim. Knowing that there's someone on the other end of the story listening carefully, well, that makes it all worthwhile. Before you go, if this story has touched you in any way, I'd love for you to let me know you're still here. Leave a comment saying, "Still here," or tell me where exactly you're watching. I'll read every single comment, feel every note of resonance. They remind me that, even in the darkest moments, we're never truly alone, as long as we're willing to reach out. If you'd like to continue accompanying me and witnessing everything that's coming, new beginnings, the healing process, and those stories that delve deep into the human soul, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support isn't just a boost for this channel, it's also giving a voice to those who've been silent for too long. Thank you for listening, and thank you for walking alongside me. This isn't an ending, it's simply where I'm finally starting anew.